Hi everyone! In today's video, we talk about how to configure your Symfony application. Configuration files stored in config directory. After Symfony installing, in the config folder you'll find three default files: bundles.php, roads.yml and services.yml. Bundles file enables or disables packages in an application. Roads file defines the routing configuration, and services file configures the services of the service container. Also, after Symfony installing, there will be packages folder. It stores the configuration files of every package installed in your application. Packages in Symfony are also called bundles, and they add ready-to-use features to your projects. If you install some bundle, the bundles.php file will be updated by default, and in the packages folder will be automatically created new bundle configuration file. And mostly you'll be working in this directory. There are three configuration formats that you can use to configure your application. First, YAML, second, XML, third, PHP. You can choose between them. There is no difference between formats because Symfony transformed it into PHP before running the application. By default, Symfony uses YAML format because it's really readable and concise. If you want to define configuration in XML format, you need to update kernel.php file to add support for the XML file extension. Here is this file. How to do it you can find in the Symfony documentation for the version 6.0. I'll show it. But you need a little bit adapt it, because starting from the version 6.1, PHP configuration loaded automatically. Oh, and here I forgot to import class. Okay. Symfony gives you opportunity to import configuration files even if they use a different format. But for this you need to install config component. To do this, use command. This component will help you find, load, combine, fill, and validate configuration values of any kind. It can be the source used whatever format: YAML, XML, YNI files, or even instance a database. So, how to import other configuration files? I'll show it. You can also load multiply files. And here you can ignore errors, for example, if the loaded file doesn't exist. Also, you can ignore all errors including invalid code and not found error. For this, use TrueValue for the Ignore Errors option. You can also import configuration files in services.php and services.xml, and I'll show how to do it. As for services.xml, it will be easier to copy example from Symfony documentation and adapt it for your needs. If you need to use the same configuration value several times, you can define it as a parameter in the services configuration file. So you don't need to repeat one configuration value in several configuration files. As parameter values, you can use any of data type or format. You can even use binary content. Oh, and also you can use PHP constants as a parameter values. I'll show how to define parameters, and I'll start from services.yml file. Then I'll show how to do it in PHP and XML files. as configuration value, you also need to add type attribute to the parameter tag, and its value will be collection. For binary content, you'll use type binary, and for PHP constant, you'll use type constant. Also, you can use Boolean value as a string. For this, you need to add type attribute to parameter tag with string value. And also, it's important to know that when you're using XML configuration, the values between parameter tags are not trimmed. Please note that up prefix in the parameter name is recommended. It helps better differentiate your parameters from Symfony parameters. If you want defined parameter in the services configuration file, further you can use it value in other configuration files using a special syntax. You need to wrap the parameter name in 2% symbols. I'll show it. Any string wrapped in 2% symbols will be replaced by that parameter value. If value of some parameter includes % character, you need to escape it by adding another % symbol. Please note that you can't use configuration parameter to build passes in imports dynamically. Now let's talk about configuration environments. So, at different times, your application should behave differently. For example, during the development process, you need to log everything and use convenient debug tools. But after deploying to production, you need speed optimization for the same application, and therefore you only want to log errors. So, in this case, we need to set up configuration environments. Or in the other words, we need to change the application behavior, changing which configuration files are loaded. There are three main types of an application environment. The first one is dev. We need it for local development. The second one is prod. We need it for production servers. And the third one is test. We need it for automated tests. Symfony loads the configuration files in this order. First config / packages / the name of the configuration file with one of three formats: YAML, XML or PHP. And the second config packages Then the name of the environment, dev, prod or test, and then the name of the configuration file with one of three formats: YAML, XML or PHP. Third, config / services with one of three formats: YAML, XML and PHP. And the fourth, config / services underline and one of the environment name, for example dev or prod or test that, and one of three formats: YAML, XML or PHP. Please note that last files override the values set in the previous ones. Large base of common configuration is stored in the config packages folder. Each environment shares it, and each environment differs only somewhat from others. In YAML and XML configuration files, you can use special when keyword to define options for different environments in a single configuration file. In PHP file, you can use if condition for this. I'll show it. you can select the active environment in .env file, which located at the project root directory. Here it. .env file is used to define the value of environment variables. So let's open .env file and find the app_env variable. Here it. If you want to run your application in production, simply change the value of the variable to prod. This value is used not only for the web commands, but also for the console commands. For example, if you execute this command, it will use the environment defined in the .env file. If you want to ignore the .env file and run this command, for example, in dev environment, you can set the app_env value before running the command. So, summing up what I talked about earlier, what is the algorithm for creating a new environment? Let's imagine that you need staging environment where the tester or the client can test the application. First, create a configuration directory, name it the same name as the environment, and you need to create this directory inside packages directory. Now, to define the behavior of the new environment, you need to add configuration file in that directory that was created in the previous step. And now you need to define staging as value of the app_env variable in the .env file. And it's all. The second approach to change behavior for your application is simply use when keyword in YAML or XML configuration files. Or in PHP configuration files, you can use if condition. Now let's talk about configuration based on environment variables. Environment variables, as the name suggests, are variables in your application that describe your environment, and they affect the way running processes will behave on a computer. It's a common practice to use Env Vars in the project, because it can change behavior of different machines without the need of changing source code. You can reference environment variables defined in any of the .env files. For this, use special syntax. I'll show it. Use environment variables if the value is changed between machines, otherwise just use parameter is enough. The values of environment variables can only be strings, but Symfony can transform the original contents of given environment variables using environment variables processors. I'll show how it works. It can be string, boolean, integer, float. It also can decode base64, JSON, CSV formats. The possibilities of environment variable processors are even greater. Read more about this in the Symfony documentation. There are three ways how to define the value of Env var. First, add the value to a .env file. Second, encrypt the value as a secret. And third, set the value as a real environment variable in your shell or your web server. Take note that a sensitive data, as some credentials, have to be encrypted as a secret. You need to encrypt it because when you dump in the contents of the env or server PHP variables or output in the PHP info function, contents will display the values of the environment variables. And let's back to the configuring environment variables in .env files. The .env file is read and parsed on every request, and the variables it contains are added to the env and server PHP variables. Any existing environment variables are never overwritten by the values defined in .env, and because of that you can combine both. The .env file shouldn't contain production values because it should be committed to your repository. It should contain only default values for local development. Also, the .env file may contain variables defined by the third-party packages. They will be added automatically when you're installing some packages. Please note that you don't need to clear the Symfony cache or restart the PHP container if you're using Docker, because the .env file is read and parsed on every request. So, what is the .env file syntax? Use uppercase for letters and also snake case for the Env Vars names. You do not need to use quotes for the value of a variable. They are needed for the line break, for example. If you want to add comments, start it with the hash symbol, like here. You can use one environment variables in values of another environment variables. I'll show how to do it. And the password in this case will be root pass. The order is very important when you define env variables, which depends on the value of another env variables. In this example, db user have to be defined first. And if you define multiply .env files, and order of env vars is wrong, db password will depend on the db user value defined in another file. If the environment variable is not set, you can define a default value. Result also will be root pass. You can empty comments using this syntax. For example, but be careful, it's not supported on Windows and it might not work depending on your shell. You can use .env.local file to override an environment value on your local machine. This local file shouldn't be committed to your repository. By default, the .gitignore file that comes with Symfony prevents local files from being committed. Let's figure out what the different types of .env files are for. First is .env file. It defines the default values of the environment variables needed by the application. This file you should commit. Second is .env.local file. This file overrides the default values for all environments, but only on your local machine. As I said earlier, it shouldn't be committed and it's ignored in the test environment. Third is .env.environment. This file will override the default values for one defined environment, but for all machines. You should commit this file. And the fourth is .env.environment. .local. This file will override the environment variables only for one environment and only on your local machine. This file shouldn't be committed. Note that real environment variables always win over Env Vars created by any of the .env files. Let's understand how to configure environment variables in production. So, the easiest way to define Env Vars is creating .env.local file on your production server. It also will be parsed and loaded on each request. You can improve performance of your application using this command. Because of that, Symfony will load the .env.local.php file to get the environment variables and will not spend time parsing the .env files. Now I'll tell you about Env Vars debugging. I made some previous work. First, I resetted the configuration settings to default. And second, I created .env.local file with database underline URL variable inside it. Here it. Now let's try to get list of the environment variables and understand how Symfony parses the different .env files to set the value of each environment variable. For this, I'll use command. As you can see here, we have two .env files. First it's .env.local and the second one it is .env. Also we see the list of the variables, and as you can see, database underline URL variable was overwritten by the same variable from the .env.local file. Also, you can get the list with all environment variables with their values referenced in Symfony container configuration. Use for this command You can also filter the list of Env Vars by adding environment name. And also you can show all the details for a specific Env Var. Next, I want to show you how to get configuration parameters in controllers and services of your application. You can get not only parameters created by yourself, but also parameters created by bundles. To see full list of existing configuration parameters, you can use this command. If you want to get configuration parameters in the controller, the easiest way to do it, extend your controller from the abstract controller and use getParameter method. I'll show how it works. First, let's create parameter in the services.yml file. Also, you can get configuration parameters in controllers and services that not extending from the abstract controller. You can do it in the same way as you inject other services by specifying them in your services definition. I'll show the example. If you use some configuration parameters in different services and controllers, you don't need to define arguments to each of them in services.yml. You can use the services defaults bind option instead. I'll show it. Also, if your service needs access to lots of parameters, it will be inconvenient to add each parameter separately. Instead of this, we can pass in the service constructor arguments container back interface and get access to the parameter through it. I'll show it. I hope you enjoy this video and see you next time.